most security teams measure their SIM deployment timelines in weeks, sometimes months. You're waiting on custom connectors, writing brittle scripts, and by the time your telemetry is actually flowing into Microsoft Sentinel, you have already spent thousands on professional services and analytics tier ingestion that you probably don't need anymore. DataBahn and Microsoft think there is a better way. You can onboard in hours, not weeks, and you can cut those costs by up to 60% using AI to route your data intelligently. And today we have with us two guests from DataBahn, Nithya Nareshkumar, co-founder and president, and Aditya Sundararam, co-founder and chief product officer at the company. Nithya, Aditya, it's great to have you both on the show.
Likewise, Swapnil. Thanks for having us.
And it's great to be back again with you, Swapnil.
It's my pleasure. And today we have a lot of exciting stuff to talk about. Of course, I have a lot of questions. But before that, I just want to, I have two co-founders, we will see the third one also in future. Since you folks are here, just talk a bit about the significance of company like DataBahn in today's world where security, AI, data, API, I mean, it's become hard to say we live in a data-driven world, we live in an API-driven world. I mean, that is the fact, without these things, nothing else exists. So let's talk about DataBahn. Then we will talk about the problem you folks are trying to solve. Then we'll talk about the whole Microsoft partnership there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So today, if you look at the landscape compared to how it was 10 years back, a lot of security deployments were mostly involved with teams collecting logs from a handful of small number of systems, but like you said, now that has exploded, right? Just exploded into hundreds of applications. Some are homegrown, some running on your own cloud, some are third-party cloud like SaaS applications, and then you still have your own on-prem infrastructure and components from where you want to collect that data. So the result of that is not just an explosion in data volume, but also an explosion in complexity. So that's where DataBahn or a solution like DataBahn comes in, Swapnil, right? And that was the biggest factor, right? When we were a part of a SIM company in our previous lives, we looked at this challenge growing with the rate at which customers' landscape in terms of how their infrastructure evolved, with AI and other technologies being adopted. So we see that as a result of that, many organizations started simply assuming that the main cost of security data itself is just SIM licensing and the compute and all of that, but often the real challenge turned out to be much deeper than that, right? Teams were often collecting the wrong data, or sometimes they weren't collecting the data that they should be collecting at all. There's so much noisy telemetry that now surfaces up because of this explosion in the architecture and components that they have. And to top it all, we now also see logs often that contain sensitive information that shouldn't be logged there, right? And now you're exposing that to third-party systems, LLMs, right? Agentic systems and all of that weren't originally intended to, right? Now, to add a layer on top of that, if you put the operational realities, when vendors change format, there is inconsistencies in terms of, how the data is processed. You suddenly start realizing, the stack that was once giving you value is no longer adding value, and that forces customers to always look for the next best, system that is out there, right? So we are, there to help fix that data foundation so that we become that layer that governs, the security telemetry even before data reaches the respective downstream consumers.
Yeah, to add to what Adi is saying, right? Like as Adi outlined, there have been these structural shifts in the industry, if you will, right? In terms of the telemetry explosion, as well as just the variety and diversity of data that came with that explosion, right? And with this, the kind of third shift was added cost pressure, and all this data going into the analytics layers, if you will, right? So what DataBahn comes to solve is, as Adi mentioned as well, that first mile of security data, right? In order to turn that into more meaningful operational data, right? Take all the raw telemetry, right? And then convert that into more operational meaningful data, because if not, it's an operational bottleneck for enterprises.
Thank you, Aditya, for explaining that in detail. And when it comes to data, I think we become greedy, that we want to collect as much data as we can collect. And sometimes, the data may be useful, may not be useful, and it could be sensitive as well. But what we are seeing, despite all these innovation and improvements, organization is still kind of struggle to extract, because data itself has no value. You have to extract value from the data. It's like crude oil, right? Itself has no value. Since the early days and now, can you talk about what has changed, whether it's the workloads, infrastructure, data, platforms, where making sense out of data, extracting value from data, especially for security operations, is becoming such a critical challenge when it comes to data pipeline?
100%. I think the way you put it, right, 10, 15 years ago, had you asked a question like that to me, I would have said that, hey, more data means, better security, right? That was the mindset that, many of us operated, rightfully so, because back then you had layered set of tools that gave you visibility into how your security posture was. But that has since changed, right? Because now you have modern endpoints, you've got, SaaS applications, you've got overlapping capabilities, within, the technology stack that customers have, which means what this manifests itself is logs where you see a lot of redundancies, logs, where a lot of operational visibility is carried over, right? Which might make sense, for the IT teams, but not necessarily, for the security teams, right? So there's overlapping telemetry that you collect and all of that, right? Which means the complexity of, how data was 10, 15 years back versus, how it is right now has significantly shifted. You see vendors, coming up with new capabilities. You see customers adopting newer technologies, which means that there's always a need for data that needs to be additionally collected. But the rate at which they're adopting new technologies and the rate at which they're actually getting telemetry out for security analytics or other use cases, there is a big, lag. So we see customers often having data sources sitting on the sidelines as a result of that, right? Because on the other side, there's platforms that are charging customers by data volume, right? Which also puts a strain on, how fast, they can monitor, right, at the pace at which they're adopting new technologies, right? So that's where we come in, Swapnil, where we help unravel or simplify this complexity, and we help customers by meaningfully optimizing and taking data that they care about, and in many cases, we see customers seeing at least a 40 to 50% optimization done as quickly as week one, right? Because the pipeline intelligently tells them, hey, here are places where you're collecting redundant information, or here are places where you're collecting data that carries absolutely no security meaning, right? That context enriched pipeline layer or pipeline is what DataBahn brings in. And to the analogy that you drew, right, we actually help that crude oil convert into refined oil by the time it leaves our pipelines to the consuming systems.
And in order to bring this crude oil right in, it takes a lot of data engineering work for enterprises, right? So the security teams are involved in the data plumbing grunt work, if you will, right? So when you bring in a pipeline or an intelligent pipeline like DataBahn, we have the security teams now focus on threat detection and investigation, which is what they're meant to do, instead of building the data engineering infrastructure, right? So that is a huge value add with an intelligent pipeline like ours.
So what does a security data pipeline platform actually do, and why is that layer becoming so important?
Absolutely. I think the simplest way to visualize what a solution like DataBahn does is we become the control plane of security telemetry for organizations. What that means is instead of every tool talking to every other system on the other side or a consuming platform, you're now introducing a intelligent data foundation that acts as that conduit or acts as that bridge, where this layer analyzes and gets the data ready for SIMs or your data lakes or other systems, right? And now soon we are seeing AI as a consumer itself, of data, right? As a lot of organizations trying to get into this agentic, security operations, mindset and all of that. Now, as an intelligent data foundation, we take on critical responsibilities like, number one, we collect and normalize telemetry regardless of where it is, right? It could be data that you're collecting from SaaS, on-prem, IoT, OT sites, you name it. We are there to help collect that data and normalize that data to a structure that every consumer can interchangeably use without having to go through that friction of doing data engineering yet another time. The second thing that we do is we also put that governance layer there, right, to check, hey, are you collecting the right data? Is the quality of the data intact? Are you seeing blind spots because one of your systems have stopped sending data? All those governance layers that was otherwise missing in security consumers or security consuming platforms like SIMs and all of that, we bring that to the table as a pipeline. The third thing is we also do that optimization as a result of that. Places where we see overlapping telemetry redundancies, low value telemetry, we help weed out, or cases where we see sensitive data moving in, we help clean that as well. And the last thing is we, as a pipeline, route the right data to the right consumer, whether it is a SIM, whether it is a data lake, whether it's an archive, that you need to push data for compliance reasons, or now increasingly in the last few months, we're starting to see the rise of agentic systems, right, that operate on top of security telemetry. And this is increasingly becoming important to enterprises because now we see enterprises realizing that as they are introducing new systems, there's no longer just one SIM solutions or one SIM solution that they rely on for analytics. You're starting to see that there's no point trying to re-engineer data every time they add a consumer, right? So this concept of federating data, and which includes data collection and data processing, is the traction that we are starting to see with larger enterprises.
A couple of years ago, right? I mean, if you'd asked us this question, Swapnil, we would have been like, yeah, the industry is warming up, right, to the construct of a data pipeline, right? But now, fast forward today, a security-focused data pipeline that understands security telemetry, can operationalize for your SOC, has become table stakes, right? That's where we are in the industry today.
What kind of interactions or what kind of feedback you get from customers, partners, where they also validate this, that yes, this is kind of becoming a priority for them?
I think one of the biggest feedback that we get to validate this, Swapnil, is finally they see their security teams focusing on core security functions like building detections or running threat hunting or writing out their own analytics, as opposed to being focused on data engineering or data operations. If you look at the security organization, it's one of the orgs that consumes the most amount of data, yet there is no discipline called data engineering within security orgs in many of the security organizations, which means somebody in the SOC is doubling down as a data engineer, right? Taking care of pipelines, taking care of parsing, transformations, and all of that. Now that challenge completely goes away, right? And that's often a feedback that we get from our partners and customers, because now the platform is acting as the 24/7 data engineer for them, right? The second thing that we see is use cases that like SIM migration, right? 4 years ago, 5 years ago, that used to take anywhere between 3 months to 12 months, right? If you include the time to evaluate a new platform and migrate from one platform to another. But with this federated data foundation, scenarios like that are becoming a non-event, right? We've seen even the largest enterprises trying to migrate close to 1,000 data feeds, switch from one platform to another in a matter of days, right? What used to otherwise take a period of 6 months, 12 months for them to validate every piece of telemetry is collected, every piece of event is accounted for between one platform to the other, which often meant that a CISO is paying for two platforms simultaneously, right, to achieve this level of parity and things like that, right? Now that problem has gone away, and we've seen customers successfully migrate from one platform to the other, right, in no time, right, and without having to spend a lot of their cycles, being heavily involved. The third thing, of course, we see is, or the feedback that we get is, the overall cost of ownership, right, or like we call it, the whole security data economics, right, where that trade-off that they always looked at, hey, should I bring this data in? Am I going to spend X amount of dollars bringing in this data? Is it worth it? Now that question no longer is a decision factor here, right? Because at the pipeline layer, they're able to consolidate that telemetry, refine that telemetry, aggregate those insights, and take what they need to these downstream systems without having to worry about opening their checkbooks, yet another time to increase their licensing or compute or anything like that. And the last thing is, with the rise of agentic systems, agentic AI-based security operations and all of that, we see that customers are able to confidently use the pipeline to send just the data that they need for these use cases without having to, again, open the floodgates and send every data to every system, and then have the concerns of security or privacy coming in the way of them adopting these technologies, right? So those are some factors that we see that validates the vision with which we are operating.
Yeah, in essence, really, right, from our customers, what we're seeing is time to value and relieving them of the cumbersome data engineering tasks, right? So and Adi made a very important point, right? It takes a matter of just minutes, or just a couple hours, sometimes maybe maximum a day or two, to onboard a complex heavy data source, right? Back in the day, it used to take even months to onboard such data sources. Enterprises don't have the luxury of waiting months to onboard this data, right? Because on the other side of the coin, adversaries are moving in minutes, right? So it's that time to value without the heavy data engineering work is what the customers are beginning to realize when they deploy a solution like DataBahn. And some of the past solutions in the industry, right, focused on log movement. Move the logs from point A to point B. So that was some of the traditional pipelines focused on, right? Not to say that capability is not important, but the modern security operations today needs way beyond log transport for the various reasons that Adi outlined.
A different way to put it, Swapnil, is folks often see data engineering to be a boring function, writing parsers, transforms, and all of that. As a company, as a product, we are excited to do the boring function day in and day out.
You recently announced an expanded partnership with Microsoft around Microsoft Sentinel. Walk us through what this integration enables for enterprises using the Microsoft security ecosystem and why it's so significant.
If you notice, Microsoft Sentinel has become one of the fastest, growing and one of the leaders in the SIEM space, right? With now them expanding into Lake and Graph and other capabilities, for organizations to easily adopt agentic use cases. Now, what our integration does is very quickly simplify how organizations can collect telemetry that gets into Sentinel, while making sure that that data is structured and transformed and put in a format that is natively analytics ready or search ready or ready for your agentic use cases, right? With DataBahn in front of Sentinel, organizations can onboard telemetry in no time. I think time to value was a factor that Nithya mentioned. They're going to see more quick capabilities for them to bring data in, put that data in a structured format, even optimize that telemetry so that they can flexibly use the different tiers that Microsoft or a solution like Microsoft offers, right? Between what goes into analytics, what goes into Lake, what goes into long-term storage. So again, the fear of operating around ingest volume and what that does to cost, that goes away, right? And again, going back to my previous point around SIM migration, as organizations are moving away from legacy systems, to something more advanced, like Sentinel and the whole Copilot stack on top of it, that migration becomes extremely quick and easy, and we facilitate being that pipeline layer that helps them with that transition very, very soon.
Yeah, it really, in a nutshell, right, it enables enterprises to activate Microsoft Sentinel much faster and more efficiently. So when you look at it with Sentinel's when you combine Sentinel's analytics and investigation capabilities, right, with an intelligent pipeline in front of it, it's back to the time to value story, right? Organizations can move from months of onboarding and deployment into operationalization in a matter of days, right? So that is what this partnership unlocks, and it's a better together story.
There's a lot of discussion right now about AI transforming security operations. Even the idea of an agentic SOC is being thrown around. Looking ahead, how does the data infrastructure layer that you are building help organizations prepare for that future?
Yeah, I think we are already starting to see, how AI is changing how security teams are have been working all along, right? In terms of, if you notice at the pipeline layer, how functions like data engineering, data monitoring, and all of that are now done by agentic workflows. That we ourselves have in our platform today. and the same on the other side of the house as well, in terms of how you go with remediation, investigations, and all of that. Right now, this has also opened up a layer that many organizations are starting to appreciate, which is AI systems need clean, structured, and trustworthy data, for it to operate on in a reliable fashion, right? But the challenge is a lot of the traditional architecture was not, designed with AI as a consumer in mind, right? Now, the concept of pipelines is also changing that. So from the DataBahn side, we help customers through the pipelines, get data in what we often say as an AI ready way, right? So that your models have the right data sets, trustworthy data sets, for them to use, depending on the use cases. So we are starting to be that data foundation for these agentic use cases here, right? Now, customers could also, as a result of that, have data that AI can reliably reason on or effectively reason on, right, without having to worry about the fidelity of results or what goes into these agentic systems and whatnot, right? So it's no longer just putting a sticker of AI or LLM on top of raw data sets, but you now have a layer that intelligently gives that context to these systems on the other side that helps customers also very quickly adopt or build other systems on the go, right, without having to always go back to data engineering or fixing data plumbing in this case.
Swapnil, you've heard this over and over again, right? High quality data is the foundation for AI, right, to be meaningful. And I'll tell you that the last decade of cybersecurity was probably building detection platforms, right? But this point onward, it's going to be about preparing the data, right, that these platforms are going to rely on. And that includes AI-based platforms as well, right? And honestly, from which organizations are going to come out as winners here, right? It's going to be those, not those that collect the most logs, really, right? It's going to be those that are able to operationalize their data sets meaningfully very quickly, right? Those are the organizations that are going to come out as winners. And DataBahn is that layer that's going to position them for that.
Aditya, thank you for joining me and sharing these insights on how DataBahn is modernizing security data operations at cloud scale with Microsoft Sentinel. And I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you.
Yes, we will meet again soon. Thank you, Swapnil.
All right. Thank you, Swapnil.
And for those watching, if you are facing similar challenges getting your security telemetry onboarded faster and more cost effectively, make sure to check out DataBahn, Microsoft, and their solutions. And don't forget to subscribe to TFiR, like this video, and share it with your team. Thanks for watching.